to give us a little bit of, as we usually do with council trainings, modified them a bit instead of our learning objectives. We're just going to start a little bit on where we hope to go with our discussion today. And it looks like we have a very intimate group. So I was going to say if we had a larger group, feel free to chat in whenever you have questions or discussion, but I think with our little group here, you should feel free to either raise your hand or chat in if you're comfortable with that, or, you know, interrupt and ask a question if you have it.
All right. So we have our typical disclaimer, and now let's get into our objectives.
Right, so our goal for today's discussion is to explore some of the historical context of Native American communities and their interaction with systems. This is, of course, particularly important for Linking Systems of Care project, to understand the history behind the communities that you are looking to reach and what their reaction might be when systems impact their lives, and then when you have system actors coming to them to try to interest them in participating in a program. So that's looking at the impact of that historical context on efforts such as the Linking Systems of Care to engage with Native American communities and victims, and in this case, of course, particularly child victims. And then have a little bit of a discussion on how to better understand cultural nuances of client populations in order to assist with that meaningful engagement of Native American communities. Then talk about the importance of the inclusion of those communities in policy, practice, and decision making. You can move that forward, Jessica. So we don't necessarily have to have this out loud or, you know, to chat it in if you feel like it, but just take a moment and consider what your familiarity is with the American Indian, Alaskan Native populations and communities in your area, either in your current experience or anywhere that you've lived. Do you have familiarity with the history? Do you know very little? Do you know pieces? How much of that history is part of what you have in your toolkit and that you lend to any outreach efforts that you have? Okay, looks like we're going to have a quiet group. so just keep that in mind, and then I'm just going to segue here for Nikki to start us off.
All right. So again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nikki Borchardt Campbell. I am Southern Paiute and Northern Ute, originally from Cedar City, Utah. I am currently the Executive Director of the National American Indian Court Judges Association. And today I'm joined by my program attorney, Ansley Sherman, who is Muskogee Creek. And this is the type of work that, you know, we really love doing. We work at NAIJA not only with our judges and helping build tribal court capacity, to handle our own internal conflicts and cases that arise on the community, on the reservation, within our communities that affect our children and families. But we also recognize that a lot of the work that we are doing to help the outcomes of our children and family also involves interfacing and working with our communities at large. So whether that's, you know, cities, counties, or the states, we are doing everything that we can to support our judges, our tribal courts, and of course our tribes to connect with their communities. And just by way of background, we at NAIJA have developed a very close partnership with the National Council that we are very proud of. So we have been working hand in hand with our tribal court judges and our state court judges, and making sure that all of the trainings that we develop at NAIJA are available to our state court judges and the systems in the state court, as well as those within our tribal communities, and vice versa. So we have a really fantastic working relationship with National Council, and we really do value our relationship because we do see that working together as opposed to, working in, individual systems is really the way to help promote those better outcomes, to address the disproportionality of, our children in out-of-home placement. And also to ensure that, as Linnell had mentioned earlier, that, our child victims are receiving the services and the care that they need. And if you are from a state where you either have tribes there or you have seen some tribal populations, we're hoping that this presentation not only helps build some context so that you can see where we're coming from historically, and I say that very generally and very broadly, but you can kind of see the history of federal policies as it is applied to tribes and families and children, and it will help you in your work moving forward, especially as you're trying to build those connections either with communities or with children and family. So that being said, we do have a small and intimate group, and here in the chat, say hello. I don't know everybody, so why don't you let us know who you are and where you're from, and that can kind of help us lead with this conversation. And since we have such a small group, we are presenting, but I definitely want this to be a conversation as well. So if you have questions, if you have comments along the way, let's make this a little more open and available to you all. So just to begin this all, we had mentioned that we want to talk about the impacts of history and historical policy, and the policy and the laws and how that's affecting our children and our families. So generally speaking, we do know that a lot of our tribes were very plentiful. We had a lot of tribal members, a lot of tribes, a lot of bands pre-contact. And then while there was contact and colonialization, there were some negative impacts, which include things which we will mention very shortly. But to introduce these two slides, since we are talking about children and families, on the left, I believe these are all from Pratt, from Carlisle. So on the left, you will see Native American children who were placed at this one, I believe, is the Pratt Institute, which was Richard Henry Pratt, the Carlisle Institute and Boarding School for Native American Children. And then you'll also see on the right a picture of those children who were taken from their homes and displaced and placed in boarding schools. So that being said, can you go ahead and start advancing the slides, Jessica? Okay, so here we are at the historical pages. So things that you may or may not know, and I touched on this very briefly, but there were a lot of policies that affected not only Native American cultures and societies as they are now, but as Ansley can also attest, there's a lot that also shaped federal Indian law. And in order to really understand all of this, in order to understand the communities, the contemporary communities, it's very important to understand the history. And for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later, that includes things like actual trauma and historical trauma, things like epigenetics we'll go into a little bit later. But these policies included removal, which most of us know about, and that was the removal of our communities, our tribes from their original homelands onto reservations. It includes a little bit of what Anne's going to talk about shortly, which is the policy of allotment. And that was where we did have groups of tribal members living on reservations, but the federal government began to prescribe individual rights to the land held in trust on those reservations and break those up so that individuals could have ownership. And from there, as a result of individual ownership, we eventually began to see the reservation base diminishing, losing the rights to that land. There is the boarding school era that I'll talk about very shortly. There's the termination era that began in 1954, which was the severing of the federal trust relationship between the federal government and Indian tribal governments. Relocation, which was a little bit more into the 1950s, which basically took individuals off from the reservation and put them into large metropolitan districts. That's one of the reasons why Linnell and I wanted to talk about, and Ansley wanted to talk about this, because even for those of you who are in states and on sites where you may not have a large tribal population, that is not to say that you don't have tribal people in your community, or even a large contingency, a large population of individual tribal members living within your communities. There is also, of course, the Indian Adoption Project, which led to the implementation of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1979. And then, of course, there are continued current practices and inherent systemic biases that are, leading into the way that our children and our families, our tribal children specifically, are being treated, and of course, contributing to those disproportionality rates for those out-of-home placements for children. So that being said, let's go ahead and keep moving forward in the slides, Jessica. So the next couple of slides, Ansley's going to go ahead and talk about. These are maps. So if we can go ahead and, Ansley, you can go ahead and talk them through the idea of land base. Most of our communities and a lot of our tribes have a lot of our cultures and our traditions grounded into our place, our oral histories, our stories, our cultural practices are tied to our land and sense of place. And I'm going to go ahead and let Ansley talk through these next couple of slides.
Thank you, Nikki. And as Nikki and Linnell mentioned, my name is Ansley Sherman. I'm Muskogee Creek, and I grew up in Oklahoma. I live in Colorado now, but I grew up in Oklahoma City, which, as you can see from this map, was once Osage land. But yeah, I want to go ahead and talk about the policies that the United States adopted and how those policies resulted in the loss of land for the tribes. So as you can see from this map, tribes spanned the entire continent. After European contact, tribes were pushed further and further west. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So here is 1784, whoops. Okay, go back.
Well, I'm not doing that.
I don't know. Well, I do the maps.
Oh my goodness.
So I see some of you from Ohio, some of you from Chicago. You can tell from these maps, that used to be tribal land. Especially after the policy of allotment, as Nikki touched on, where the land passed from reservation and tribal ownership to individual ownership. The individual tribal members were expected to, or the policy was for the individual tribal members to farm the land, and that didn't always go over so well because a lot of the land that was allotted was either desert land or couldn't be farmed. It wasn't viable for agricultural purposes. And we're still seeing today the effect of allotment with the it being passed down as family members passed away. Once that land is divided up so many times, it's no longer, the land plots are too small to farm. So anyway, so we see here in these maps the loss of land through treaties and allotment. If you could go to the next slide. So all of these policies contributed to the loss of land and contributed to where we are today with what is considered Indian country. And like Nikki said, we have these present day reservations, but a lot of Native Americans don't live on reservations. And sorry about that. And Nikki, if you want to go further into.
And so we definitely just put a lot of these, and I know we're having a little bit of tech problems, but we wanted to put these maps here to illustrate that there were a lot of tribal people, and then they were slowly technically moved west, as Ansley mentioned, to the current state of where it is now. And so, you know, Jessica, if you wanted to just keep flipping through those, you could just slowly see those land bases and those land claims for the tribal land slowly diminishing, slowly disappearing. And then if you go back to this one, this is the current state of tribal land right now. So Montana, those of you in Montana, you have a good amount of tribes there. Chicago, not, and Illinois, not so much, but you know, that's not to say that you don't have, as Ansley mentioned, large populace of tribal members from a variety of tribes in your communities. So go ahead and Jessica, and go on to the next one. So now, you know, we kind of want to get into the real heart of this presentation, which is really talking about your understanding of tribal communities, trying to help you understand tribal communities, and then giving you some tips to engage with tribal communities. And we didn't really get a lot of answers in the beginning to Linnell's question about your familiarity with tribal people. You know, I am a giant proponent of, you know, working against the contemporary stereotypes of current tribal or of historical tribal people and the way that those are seen in the media. That includes everything from, and this is a small tangent, everything from sports teams to how tribes and tribal members are essentialized, and people thinking that tribal people are only historical peoples. And not really seeing people as contemporary. So all of those types of media images are harmful. So just think about maybe if you've heard or seen anything in the media related to Indian families and Indian children lately. You know, maybe some of the media you've seen or encountered might make light of the importance of tribal collective rights in the context of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And, you know, maybe there are some media and some stories you've seen that might paint a particular picture of the tribe, of the way that tribes interact with children and families. And, you know, maybe even have you question the existence of things like the Indian Child Welfare Act. So there are a lot of things like that out there in the media right now that might not paint either tribal people or our collective rights in trying to help the healing and intervening of our children and the best light right now. So this context is important, but why do you ask? So again, historically, we're talking about how these policies affected our children from both the private and the government actors, and those effects on our children and families. And unfortunately, those policies that were supposed to help did not. No surprise there, but they've caused a lot of pain, they've caused a lot of suffering, and they've done so for generations. So when you cannot eliminate a group of people, which were happening, you know, in the early 1800s, from what you may have already read or understood from history, reservationism, removal, then what happened in the government policy is assimilation. So there were efforts to kill the Indian and save the man in the late 1800s. The most famous, as I mentioned earlier, was Richard Henry Pratt, who established the Carlisle Institute. That was one of the very first government-run tribal boarding schools. And so the federal government at that point had implemented the policy where every single Indian child was to attend boarding schools. And the purpose of the schools on paper was to provide an education for those Native children and for the population generally. But in reality, it was to ensure that those Native children weren't practicing and weren't learning the culture and the language of their people. So they were taking the children, oftentimes without the consent of their parents, or if there was consent, it was oftentimes done under duress with regard to the whole tribe. And those children were taken from their homes where they were in, loving communities, loving families, learning their tradition, learning their heritage, learning about the land, learning stories, being loved, talking their language, to a very prescribed way of living that punished them for being who they were. So the parents and the grandparents clung to these traditions, and they ensured that our communities and our Native children were learning these things. And the whole point of that policy was to ensure that those children never learned it, and that they were assimilated into the quote unquote white society, that they were educated, and that they were able to get jobs that were acceptable to the federal government. So Jessica, go ahead and click through these next slides. These are real comparisons. So it went from traditional children to children who were civilized. As you can see, they are in Western wear, Western dress. They're in non-traditional clothes there. And you can keep flipping through, Jessica, to show some of these examples. So traditional dwellings into the boarding schools. And most of these children were having to make these changes almost overnight. And unfortunately, we lost so many children. I wish that we were being figurative about this, and we were saying that we lost them to the mainstream society, but so many of these children died. So many of these children are buried on the ground. Sometimes we just outright literally lost these children. It is still affecting our families to this day, because a lot of our tribes and communities are still accepting the children back home and trying to go through that healing process. So a lot of these former federal places are repatriating these children back to their tribes. So this is still very heavy. There are still communities who are grieving these lost children. You can keep going, Jessica. So the adoption project. So through the 1800s, and actually even into the 1900s, we had the boarding school. And I would even say now some of those historical boarding schools have turned into, tribal schools, tribal run schools, and into the 50s. So that's my grandmother's generation. That's, my great grandmother lived through all of this. And before we move on to the adoption project, since I'm speaking about, my grandmothers and my family in particular, some of the lasting impact is, my grandmothers all had tattoos on their hands. And I had asked very early on as a child what those particular tattoos meant or how they received them. And one of my grandmothers said that my great grandmother Jake tattooed all her children in the instance that they were taken from her and sent to boarding school. And that was a way that she would be able to identify them in the future when she started to look for them. So those types of things are carried on and they are passed down. So those stories are also passed down. So, those aren't foreign concepts to a lot of us. Those stories of boarding school trauma are passed down from generation to generation still. So once that assimilation project didn't quite work with the federal government, the next step was an outright effort to remove children from tribal homes. So now we have the adoption project from 1958 to 1967. This is no surprise that this also overlaps with the termination policy, which generally lasted from about 1954 through the late 70s. When they started reestablishing some of those federal trust relationships with the tribes again. So this era was also pretty harmful, but in a different way, only because this project was really about removing children from their homes, oftentimes alleging neglect, using foreign standards in order to measure whether or not a child was being adequately or safely raised in their communities. And so here you could see that it was a 9-year federal contract. The goal was to provide white adoptive parents for Native American children whose parents were deemed unable to provide suitable homes. And then oftentimes it was to save those Native children again. So we're going back to this concept of, you know, their tribal homes aren't good enough. You know, poverty equates neglect. You know, culture equates neglect. And in order to save these children, we need to take them from their Indian homes and we need to place them in white families or families of an entirely different means and way of life than their tribal homes. So, you know, this period and these policies lasted and were actually part of the impetus of the Indian Child Welfare Act, only because so many children are removed. So again, using someone else's standard, in the end, about 25 to 35% of all Indian children were being placed in out-of-home care. And 85% of those children were being placed in non-Indian homes or institutions. That's 85% of those children, non-Indian homes. So the legacy of these practices continued for many, many more years, and it resulted in many more removals. And like I said, it ultimately led up to the implementation of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is something that, you know, a lot of us are still trying to understand how that works in our state communities, how to connect with tribal communities, how to engage with tribal communities and those services. So that's really why all of this is important, for you to understand how we got to this point as tribal members, as tribal communities. You can go ahead and move on, Jessica. Again, we've got the termination and urban relocation program, which is, so I'd mentioned that the termination was just the severing of the federal trust relationship between tribes and the federal government. And then around the same time, that's the Urban Indian Relocation Program, which resulted in relocating tribal citizens to metro areas, including Chicago, Denver, where we're at, which is why you see a lot of tribal nonprofits in the Denver metro area, because there are so many natives here, and it's very central also to a lot of the tribal communities and reservation bases in the West. And that's, of course, why we're here. And so you've got Chicago, Denver, LA, a lot of tribal people in LA, Cleveland, Seattle, San Francisco, you know, a lot of the metro areas, actually. So those citizens were encouraged to go to metro areas to find different jobs and to get away from the reservation. So you can go ahead and move into the next slide, Jessica. And then here we've added the slide so that you could go ahead and see those metro populations between, you know, it's about 7 years old, but between 2009 and 2013. Linnell, did you say that this was a census map?
Yes, and that's why it's that out of date, because it's, of course, based on when the census comes out. So yeah.
Yeah. So you can see the population areas. You know, of course, we have a lot of folks here from Illinois, so you can kind of see right there that you do have some good populations, tribal populations of individual tribal members in the Chicago area. Montana, you of course have actual reservation lands in your state, but then you can also see the I guess more populous areas in the cities and towns that you also have a lot of tribal members living there as well. And so this is just for reference so that you can see that while a lot of the actual tribal reservation lands are out to the west, we have tribal members and members from individual tribes scattered all across the country. So just because you are in a state that does not have a federally recognized tribe or even state recognized tribes or bands, that you should not overlook learning about tribal people and how to engage with tribal people, because there are individuals from various tribes probably living in your communities. All right, go ahead and move forward, Jessica. And then this is, again, we saw this map earlier. This is just the map of reservation, current federally recognized and reservation lands right now. I think that might be a little old too. All right. Linnell, did you want us to cover this one?
If you want to, or I can pick it up, whatever you're comfortable with.
You could go ahead and pick it up from here if you want.
Okay.
We can jump in.
Thank you. So yes, I think as Nikki and Ansley talked about very well, the context is, of course, key to understanding the populations that you're looking to engage with or to make contact with or to build trust with. And so as you can see from just the history of the land base upheavals of communities, and then, you know, the corresponding policy upheavals and changes that marked most of the interactions of most tribal communities and tribal governments at the different stages of American history. And then that leads us, I think, to talking a little bit about what are the impacts of that, and looking at statistics and understanding of where the communities are right now. So politically, as historically speaking, as Nikki talked about, different policies and the programs that affected both community-wide placement of tribal people and individual families. The tattooing of the children is one of those disturbing little things that, you know, you hear and it sort of rings in your head for as long as you think about these programs. And I have a similar interaction with a video that I saw talking about a community member whose family was taught when somebody knocked on the door that was obviously not from their community, that the children had hiding places that they knew to go to within their home because of just the fear that was learned fear based on interactions with outside systems and members of systems that were not from within the community. And one of those impacts is, of course, the use of not only just the cultural identity, but poverty was another reason for the breaking up of families. And so, you know, the creation of policies and programs that basically caused the poverty in the first place, and then using that poverty as a reason to further break up the consistency and connection of Native families and Native communities. And so you can see here some of the statistics about not only the adoption project, but then the additional use of terms such as neglect and social deprivation that was basically driven completely by the perception of the culture that the outside system was interacting with, and then deeming that culture as unable to provide for children based on nothing more than those cultural stereotypes. Jessica, if you can move forward. And so the context of understanding all of these interactions, and then the people that you're interacting with now, you've got to understand that those traumas that affected families and the stories that are passed on through community and through individual families, that's the historical trauma. And it is shared, and the more that we learn about historical trauma, the more that we know that this too is passed along. That it is actually becomes part of not only community identity, but it becomes part of the individual's DNA, and it can be passed along just like any other family understanding. And so collectively, there's the emotional and psychological injury that has happened both individually to people, as Nikki pointed out with the adoption project, that's within our lifespan, that's within our aunt's lifespan, with our parents' lifespan. So those are first person stories. And then, you know, the historical story of what happened before that generation that led them to that place or that time or to that connection. And then also, you know, as as stated, that the understanding of historical trauma, like the trauma-informed practices that you all are focusing on and implementing so well, up until recently, the lack of understanding or inclusion of that concept led to this disenfranchised grief as well, which is that if you've never been told or understood by anyone that yes, this was an impact and it was a trauma to you, then you've never had the opportunity to actually grieve that loss or that injury, and then therefore come to understand it or come to deal with it. And so it becomes yet another part of what you have as a community and an individual to contend with in order to interact with your community and find ways to heal. So some of the impacts, I think, is you can see is just the differential in the communities and the understanding of the impacts of those policies. And so if you, as Nikki was saying, if you start out with a community that's very place-based, and the overarching policy of interactions with the federal and state governments is to move them from those places to someplace else, then you've got a very basic breakdown of understanding between two cultures. And similarly, you've got a historical impact to a very verbal culture, where the generations are responsible for verbally carrying stories onto the next generation. And that is seen as a significant learning and a way to understand and orient yourself in your culture. And then you remove those generations from the family. And so somehow you have to still figure out a way to tell your story without people who were meant to carry that through. And then you've got the impact of removing children wholesale through the boarding school process, and then the adoption programs, and then the relocation programs that remove people physically into urban centers. And then, so you have entire generations who never saw what healthy parenting was because they were removed from the home where they would have learned that in the first person. And so then you've got people who were raised by institutions or who were raised by people outside of their community, and so they never learned first person of what that through line of healthy parenting was. And so then they had to try, so then you've got that additional historical impact and trauma to the community. And I think everyone is familiar with, anyone who's gone to any trainings from the council, and we've talked about what are the impacts of all of this and what we know now, which is disproportional impact. So we know that these historical and ongoing traumas and policies and programs are directly related to or correlated with what we see in terms of impacts to women and families within Native communities. There's a disproportional number of American Indian and Alaskan Native women who are likely to experience intimate partner and sexual violence. That number, as you see at the bottom, is pretty startling, with almost 50% of women having reported experience domestic violence in their lifetime. So you can move that forward. And anytime you're looking at domestic violence, of course, you need to consider the impact on the children in the home, because we know that the children are very likely to witness it. So disproportional impact on children at risk is that at least 31% of children who witness IPV or domestic violence in their home also report being physically abused themselves. And that we also know generally that other experiences of racism, prejudice, discrimination, bias increase children's vulnerability to different types of harm. So it's the compounding of trauma. We know that from the recent report that came out looking at VAWA's implementation of the special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction in Indian country. Those of you who aren't familiar with it, was a special pilot program to implement tribal communities having, recognizing additional jurisdictional tools to allow them to prosecute domestic violence related crimes and issue protection orders. And at the end of the first 5 years of the implementation of that project, they put out some statistics and studies. And one of them is, of course, this exposure, that at least 58% of the incidences that they recorded that involved domestic violence, and across all of the jurisdictions that implemented it, there were children somehow involved in that incident, whether or not they were witnesses within the home or somehow otherwise involved in the actual violence. And we know that those children who witnessed that violence are very likely to actively engage and attempt in some way, shape, or form to intervene in any type of violence that's going on, either by yelling or trying to leave or calling out for help. And of course, that then further traumatizes and has an impact on response, and the children's then response to systems and involvement in systems. Jessica, if you can move. The disproportional impact on children in care in the United States is that the Native population is disproportionately represented in the foster care placement and the child welfare systems. And as well, some of the more recent information that's being gathered about trafficking is that there is a vastly disproportional impact on trafficking victims of Native American community members and children. Nikki, I don't know if you wanted to jump in or...
Yeah, absolutely. So what does this mean for Native children today? So as you can see here, that a lot of our children are at increased risk for lower well-being measures. So, just by being Native themselves, we deem them at risk as a part of an at-risk population. So here you're seeing that there are negative health outcomes and increased risks for chronic diseases. There's higher rates of teen pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, and HIV. There's mental health issues. And oftentimes there's a lot of unresolved mental health issues and unresolved trauma happening in our families. And there's an increased risk for suicide. Prior to COVID, I'm sure these numbers have affected what we knew about the death rates for teenagers, but suicide was the leading cause of death for our young adults leading into COVID. So that's a problem that plagues a lot of our young adults. And, of course, a lot of this is from trauma, actual trauma, unresolved trauma. And as we've mentioned here, the other negative health outcomes as well. So health issues, decreased educational attainment, that, this is a whole other conversation, but you're also seeing things like the pipeline to prison, the way that children are systemically discriminated against in a lot of, our schools, especially some of our reservation schools, higher rates of unemployment, increased likelihood of incarceration and those rates of poverty. And then, of course, the higher probability of involvement in delinquency cases. So, this all ties into other kind of issues and societal issues like mass incarceration, not only for, Native American men, but for our men of color, Black men as well. And these types of issues are, of course, plaguing our Native children in a similar way that it's plaguing other children of color as well. Go ahead and move on to the next slide. And so, while we do talk a lot about the historical context and the historical context of trauma, it's also really important to understand and to talk about resilience as well. Because while a lot of our tribes have suffered that collective grief and that collective trauma of US policies, all of our individual tribes have also found ways to build resiliency and to survive despite those circumstances. And so I definitely say a lot generally as far as, talking about our tribes and our tribal people. Every single one of our tribes is different, individual. They all have individual languages, individual traditions. Their languages are different, even from band to band. So that's important to know as well if you're working and trying to make those connections with tribes. So as to not overgeneralize, but what we do know is that being connected to our culture promotes resiliency. It builds those resiliency factors and helps, our children and our families to a point where they can have better outcomes. So things like strengthening that cultural bond helps build resiliency. And even if it's making that connection between a child or a person who needs assistance to some aspect of their culture, we're seeing that is helping. We have healing to wellness courts, which are very similar to which are the tribal iteration of drug courts. And we see a lot of tradition happening in those courts in order to heal those individuals with substance use disorders, and especially with those juvenile healing to wellness courts. It's important to connect those kids with some aspect of the culture, whether or not it's having an elder to talk to or learning how to fish and that subsistence living. There's that connection which we're showing and seeing in real time is building those resiliency factors so that these individuals can move beyond the circumstances that made them justice system involved in the first place, onto having a better chance, reducing recidivism, getting them out of the system. Here we've listed language, ceremony, healing practices, mentorship by elders, participation in community activities, and really ensuring that those individuals have connection to the tribe and community beyond just clinical interventions. Not to say that the clinical interventions aren't just as important, but this kind of rounds it out as well. You're talking about addressing some of that unresolved trauma, but you're also building in some of the good things that have helped your people and tribal people sustain and continue to thrive. So healing and resilience is strongly tied to a lot of our tribal cultures. And again, that's not to, it's a little bit of an overgeneralization. A lot of our tribes are still heavily practicing our traditions and cultures, have connections to the language, but not all tribes do. And so, as we're talking about connecting with tribes to hopefully have some better outcomes for the children and those victims of crime, it's important to know that as you're approaching individual tribes, that as you're doing that type of outreach, you want to know what services and what culture helps those bonds and helps build resiliency, but try not to overgeneralize it. Try not to also impart some prescribed understanding of what you think the tribe should be doing to help promote resiliency. But generally there are a lot of cultural and tradition that help build resiliency in our kids. So go ahead and move forward. Jessica, thank you. Sorry, I jumped the gun there a little bit. Nell.
It's okay. And so that brings us, I think, into focus with our topic for today, which is just generally focusing in on engagement and ideas and thoughts about how to make those approaches. I think a lot of what we've done so far in terms of the themes that I've been hearing in the discussion is applicable to the discussion about outreach and connections and linking systems with Native American communities, building trust, collaboration, ideas about shared goals and finding common ground. But I give a shout out to one of our participants, which is our judge in residence, Judge House. She introduced me to this lovely quote from Anais Nin. When we start to talk about cultural competence and the view of building those relationships, we have to take into account our own biases and understand that the way that we see the world doesn't necessarily reflect on who we're seeing, but it reflects on ourselves first. And that everything that you do and in your work and in your personal life is based on your own cultural identity. And that can shift depending on where you are and who you're with. And that includes your institutions. Institutions have cultural identity too. And so as a first step, we often suggest to people just take a moment and think about when you self-identify for your cultural identity. How do you do that? Is it based on where you're working? Is it, when your first thought on that, is it who your family is? Is it how you grew up? Is it, how do you identify in any given way in any community or any conversation that you're having? And how can that help you connect with whomever it is that you're speaking with? I think an interesting way of viewing that shifting of an importance and focus of culture is as Nikki was talking about the boarding school history and the trauma that's associated with that. And that is, I think, well known for those of us who've worked within tribal communities. One of the first communities I worked with was Hopi in Arizona. And, there were a lot of stories down there about kids who were basically stolen. I knew people who had been returned to the community or had found their way back. And so they would tell the story of their removal to the boarding school. And the boarding school they were talking about was Stewart Indian School. And Stewart Indian School is actually here in Nevada, where I am, and it's not far from us here. When I moved to Washoe and started working for the Washoe tribe here in Nevada, I came to find out that historically and culturally speaking, they're quite proud of the Stewart Indian School because it was within their community, and it was a place for their kids to be educated close to home because this was their home. And so that view there was completely a 180 of community identity and culture and how it was related to that impact of the boarding school process. And so it's just a little glimpse of how complicated that idea of cultural identity and the historical impacts can be, and the people that you're talking to and how they may have individually understood and internalized their particular history. And Jessica, if you can move that forward. So looking at interaction and outreach, one of our first discussions is often with cultural competence is in your own self-bias, and is examining your own assumptions and what you know, and how you apply that to the perceptions of the families that you interact with. Erin had a comment earlier in the chat about her first experience with an undergraduate professor who had given her some history of the indigenous communities, and then basically, turned her focus and view and understanding of the history that she'd been taught earlier. And so it's just that understanding of what you know, and starting to develop an understanding of what you don't know, in order so that your assumptions don't negatively impact your ability to reach out and build trust and build community and build understanding. And instead approaching those ideas of outreach and engagement from a methodical standpoint of understanding your goals and objectives, and coming up with an approach and understanding of how to reach out to and understanding the reality of the communities that you're interacting with, and so that you can impact the lives of children and families who are system involved, so that your approach to them is not, either furthering any negative impact with that interaction, but then also possibly building that relationship and building the opportunity for others who come after you to build that trust. And we've got a comment in, if you take a look in the chat, from Judge House. Thank you, Judge House, for offering that. And she's got a little perspective of additional history and interaction between former slaves and the Buffalo Soldiers in the West, and their interaction with the tribal communities in the West, and a further look into the very complicated nature of our history and understanding and cultural interactions. So what we were thinking is good takeaway points, in addition to Nikki talking about the healing and resilience factors, which are important within community, in which we're, even now coming to greater understand the strengths of those resiliencies within Native communities, is that there's interactions with for your programs, and you're looking to link up systems is of course a way for you to try to spread your goals and objectives out to the broadest possible community, but to understand also that you might find ways within those tribal communities to link up systems for additional care that could actually have the so it's more of a back and forth, which is that you have systems to offer that you can link up those communities to, but you should also approach it from the understanding that those communities can have systems that you might be able to help and link up to that could go back and help you as well.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Linnell, just briefly, it's also important to note that since our tribal governments are sovereign governments, that they oftentimes have their most of the time they have their own systems players, and those individuals, we have social services, you have judiciaries, you have folks in the executive who are providing those types of services to the tribal families already. And you are seeing a lot happening in our tribal communities where there's oftentimes an amalgam of using the evidence-based practices to help our victims, and incorporating those culturally appropriate support systems as well. So we do have a lot of examples of that multidisciplinary work to approach, healing and care for our children and families. So it's really important to identify, okay, so, and I know in certain circumstances, you aren't necessarily looking to see whether or not a child or an individual is a tribal member, but if they are, being able to outreach to that tribal government and to understand, who those systems, who's at the head of each of those systems, and to try to assess, how you can work together and what other services might be available on the tribal side to help the individual who needs assistance and to support them. So, that outreach is really important as well, and to not go in with any assumptions, but to basically reach out to them as if they are another government, that government to government kind of connection. So sorry, Linnell,
No, that's okay. We're looking we've got a few minutes, and we've got to wrap up as well. So if there's anything more you wanted to share, feel free. But yes, I just had a lovely reminder from Judge House in the chat, as well as my language choice of cultural competence, which is a good reminder, which is that, we're talking about a vast and inherently different community. We talk about Native American communities generally, but of course they're each individualized, and there's no possible way for you all or any of us to understand the individual community history and impacts and issues and their particular history in Chicago versus in Montana, and what that means and for you in your efforts. But what we can do is be aware of what we don't know and approach each interaction with humility and openness to that lack of understanding or that lack of context, or the openness to learning more. If you know a little, and there's more out there to be learned.
Yeah. And that's not also to say that, you have to reinvent the wheel, but, there are a lot of communities out there in states who have, engaged with tribal communities. So, also take advantage of National Council and, talk to NAIJA. I'm pretty sure between the two national organizations, if you were trying to make certain connections or looking for examples of MOUs, we can help you connect or show you those examples and provide some comparative information and background for you to go ahead and move forward and trying to make your own connections. So, there's a lot of resources available as well. So, feel free to always reach out to National Council and to reach out to NAIJA. And if you want to have, more of an in-depth discussion about any of this, or even, Linnell is a fantastic resource, and so is Judge House. So, just make sure that you are reaching out to the folks who are trying to build those connections between tribal and state communities, because, we're here and we want to ensure that those connections are built and that there are healthy connections.
Just if you can move us forward. Yeah, so we've got, I think, 5 minutes left, and we're running out, I think, into the end of here. So we've got some opportunity if there's some questions or a discussion that wants to be, that you've got. But I think a good ending point, or at least a good starting point for your thinking about a strategy, is some of the discussions that we had, I think especially rung in my head earlier with the judges, which is, just because one strategy or effort at outreach didn't work or didn't have the outcomes you wanted, that doesn't mean that you can't try again or come at it from a different angle, or rethink your strategy, or okay, well, go out for sushi, as Judge Rosa told us. Find something that you have in common with the community that you're looking to outreach, and see if that's a way in the door to start to build a relationship, and not necessarily expecting that your first interaction is going to be successful, but that the best, be dogged and determined, and somehow hope that over time you can build trust. And that includes the humility concept, that understanding of walking in the door, knowing what you know, but also understanding there's a lot that you don't know. And that that eventually a good goal is to back that relationship out, so that the involvement in the discussion is on overarching policy and practice, and idea generating at the beginning, as opposed to inclusion and as an ongoing project, or hey, we're looking, we're in the middle of a project and we're looking to do this, are you interested? And then, moving that outreach back as far as possible, so that the inclusion and the discussion gets to be about, implementing ideas and initial ideas about goals and objectives for any sort of practice or policy that you're looking to implement, or a system that you're looking to improve. And I guess that's, any other thoughts, Nikki or Ansley?
No, Linnell,
Okay.
I think that, with that kind of little bit of closing, that's exactly it. And, find those connections, and to know that, our tribes, our families, we all have the same end goal. We want healthy families. We want safe children. We want, we just want the best for our kids. And, that's something that I'm comfortable saying is a shared goal and vision for almost all of our tribes and all of our people and all of our families. We want to ensure that our kids have, the best opportunities to be well and to be safe. So, even leading with that and knowing that, and, discarding any bias, and understanding any bias that you might have, and being open about that. And while you're approaching and trying to make connections with tribal communities, that's all going to be very helpful. But just knowing that we just want healthy and safe families. We want our children to be well. And, we want them to grow up to be, amazing, resilient individuals, and just happy. So just know that we all have that same vision leading into this. And some of, our kids and our families need a little bit more help than others. And we know that is the truth across race and communities. And we're hoping that we can just, find ways that we can all work together so that those individuals who need the help get the help.
Well, and I was all worried that we were not going to have a time to fill, and it looks like I've eaten up all of our time, so that we don't really have a whole lot for you all to ask questions or ask for input or have a discussion. But I think we've got Illinois and Montana, which is, I'm manager over those sites management, and I'm happy, of course, to continue those conversations here with any discussion that we have ongoing. And for those of you who I have not met, I'm Linnell, and you can get my contact information from Hunter or Jessica or Wendy or anyone at the council. And I have Nikki and Ansley's information, and more than happy to try to help you make those connections and have that discussion elsewhere. So thank you so much for your time and your attention. This was a lot of fun. And as always, Nikki and Ansley, it's so good to work with you. Thank you so much for your time and helping us out here.